Welcome back to the Classic Adventure Gaming Podcast. I'm Gus, and as usual, I'm joined by my boy Josh. Josh, how you doing this fine evening?
Doing great, Gus. Super excited to be back from our little hiatus there. I'm happy to say we've got a great panel of guests, same guys as last time. So we've got EOTB, Zerbus, Milan, and Prince of Nothing. And together we're just going to be going in on a deep dive, covering everything related to dungeons. So we're going to be talking about designing them, running them, and then getting a great list of useful resources for you guys to aid you in that. So should be a really exciting podcast.
Yeah, no question about that, Josh. This is going to be the definitive podcast related to dungeon design for fantasy adventure games. So, without further ado, let's jump into it with the boys.
Alrighty, so I figured I'd just kind of start throwing out a question and then we can just kind of go off of that. We're kind of just going to be going over basically dungeon design as well as running dungeons. So I figured we could just start with talking about maybe what separates like a lair or hex entry, a proper like regular dungeon, and a mega dungeon. So just what each of them kind of contributes and maybe different design considerations for each of them. So what are y'all's thoughts on that?
I think that they definitely support different things. Hex entries, there you're trying to build out exploration play. So you give the world small details that other game mechanics hang off of. You got geographical details, demographical details, all of that. Where the mountain passes are, who controls the mountain pass. That could lead to creating orc tribes or smugglers or fortifications. And if you create fortifications, then you're defining country borders and all of that. So it's the genesis of world building. It's the Legos, the individual Lego pieces of world building. Proper dungeon, those are the game pieces that are designed to be consumed and finished. You're going to have an empty plate at the end, probably. So it's finite chunks of gameplay. Mega dungeons are the endless buffet, the bottomless cup of dungeon play.
I think I had a take that was sort of similar. That, well, especially in the beginning, a dungeon is almost like it's like an anchor or maybe even a massive body. That's sort of like it attracts players in the beginning. It gives an easy thing to do, to have adventures in. And then, gradually as the players increase in power, the scope of the game changes. They'll want to branch out and they'll want to explore a little bit more. And then hex entries and lairs, I kind of view that as for the most part, right? This is more like the connective tissue between these major dungeons where a lot of the play is going to take place. This is, of course, like in the beginning. Eventually, who knows where your game will end up, and as the mobility of the players increases, maybe they'll be doing more wilderness crawling or who knows what. But definitely in the beginning, these dungeons are sort of like the tent poles for your campaign, where a lot of the action is going to take place. And a mega dungeon is that, but like as E says, it's something that's really potentially almost bottomless.
We can add that scale deepens dungeon gameplay. You can have the simple basics in something like a hex entry or a lair. The play procedures and the experience gets more involved and more in depth as you go into a larger dungeon, and it reaches its full potential and scope in a mega dungeon. So this is one area where the size of a dungeon, its dimensions and complexity matters.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up with this this recent trend of the 5-room dungeon, which I guess ironically isn't a horrible idea if you just make if you make a little lair somewhere in a little cave. It doesn't really need to be that involved or complex, but trying to I guess where the distortion happens is when people look at dungeons in general and just try to reduce it to this sort of Potemkin village format.
I still think 5-room dungeons are just a subconscious revolt against McMansions and suburbs.
No, but I think there's also a sort of like demon of convention there, where if you as soon as imagine playing D&D and almost everything is like would fit that 5 dungeon format. That would be the most sort of boring mechanistic thing ever, right? Part of this game too is that as soon as you go underground, you don't really know what to expect. It's exciting. You don't know what you're going to be up against. All these different challenges, and then like when you reduce it to something like that, 5-room dungeon, it's crap.
You can almost find everything out in a hex crawl. You can find something good. You can find something bad. You can find just basically the equivalent of like a dungeon entry. You could find a dungeon. You could find a little lair that's only got 4 rooms. You can find a whole dungeon that goes down 3 floors. But the part of hex crawling that it's approached to by 2 different methods. There's the more procedural hex crawling, where people are just kind of like going on the fly and they're just, they're seeing what's there. The inception of the world hasn't been fully realized, so they're sort of going outward. Or then there's the other approach where you've established countries, you've established islands, you've established oceans, you know what's there, you know where the points of light are, you know where the dungeons are, you know where the tribe of hobgoblins is hiding. And a lot of that really brings the world together. Whereas if you go down into a dungeon, that's a site, and that site needs to make sense as much as a site needs to make sense, whether it's 3 floors of a dungeon or, a 7-room complex. And then, of course, going to the mega dungeon, you start getting looser on the rules because it's so massive that there could be multiple things leaking into multiple areas. And you get to basically just keep feeding off of that trough. But with the hex crawl, it sort of has to make sense. You wouldn't have a farming village that's all peaceful and full of daffodils right next to a giant orc encampment, right? It would be raids.
Isn't that something like where you as the DM have to you have to find a way to make it fit, right? I mean, if it's completely ridiculous, sure, maybe you dismiss it. But very often, I feel there's probably a way you can get that to work. Maybe they have a non-aggression treaty with the orcs or whatever, the ancient curse, or something like that.
There is definitely a power in orc combinations. That's where the unexpected happens in your own mind. That's the wonder of random generation.
There was also Wilderlands, right? Where sometimes you would have this, 120 lawful good halflings ruled by a chaotic evil fighter or something like that, and then you start thinking, "Hey, what's going on here?"
Yeah,
right?
that's a story there. It's like I have a pretty good example. Good example of that is that like if you meet a camel in a desert, that's wildlife. If you meet a camel in a temperate forest, that's a story.
Yeah, it's absolutely a story. The problem comes in is when you don't make it fit, right? If somebody just takes it as face value and doesn't make it fit, and then you have those players sitting there, it's like, wait a minute. If this giant tribe of like 1,200 orcs is like 2 miles away from this rich, flush with money village, why hasn't anything happened?
I think that's the key. I think that because part of what you need as a DM isn't just places and things and stuff for players to do, but also stuff for players to hear about that they're not involved in. So in a case like that, I might throw it out. I might say, okay, well, Daffodil Village is about to get wrecked, and the players are going to hear about it, and only one of these 2 things will exist for more than 4 days.
Or maybe they're afraid of something in Daffodil Village, right? Maybe they've got rumors that there's a powerful wizard there and they're afraid of getting turned to frogs. Or maybe the Daffodil Village is actually like sending them a tribute. Or you can make up any number of justifications, and that makes things good and it makes things a little bit more interesting. But overall, if you're doing like 500 hexes, not everything can be an exception, right?
Well, if the tables are any good, most of those results will make sort of sense, right?
Right. But I agree. I mean, with Zervis, I mean, one role of a DM is definitely to throw out some things. You know, you're still the agent of the primary agent of play. So you allow things to fit that wouldn't come to your mind, and you also do throw some stuff out. And I think with experience, it gets to be pretty quick to figure out like which ones are which.
You, particularly in dungeons, you also have development through play that you are probably early on you are not aware of all the connections and all the linkages, all the rationales. But as the players interact with the dungeon or the wilderness, fit the pieces together. Some of it might be true, some of it not, but it evolves, and things that don't make sense at first might later on. And of course, on the other hand, you might have things that will always remain as mysteries, and that's an important element, that there should be something beyond the circle of light that players are seeing. This is especially important for dungeon play.
For dungeon play, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that they're the weird makes sense. What I tend to throw out is more mundane stuff that is it just doesn't make a rationale. Like I was doing hexes and I happened to pop 40,000 population cities right next to each other. I mean, not close enough that they could be considered one mega city, but too close for it to make sense that there
I'll
were
make a river. I mean, yeah, if you've already drawn the water, right? But I would
right.
say
You
draw a
you
river
can
between that, and then both of them control the control one side of the bridge, and they're hostile, right? Yeah.
right. You could make it fit, but in that case, it was like something I was willing to throw out because I didn't want to reshape the geography of the entire
Yeah,
world
of course.
with a new water basin. You know, so you just have to know when to do it and when not to do it.
Yeah, and I think that the important point is that everybody that's sitting in this room has done this once or twice. You know what I mean? So we all know how to pivot. We all know how to use what we're given. But the more educational purpose of what I would like to think that this podcast is reaching out to is that the people that are just like, man, I haven't done a hex crawl yet. I haven't done this, and if they're not prepared to make the calls on just running something pre-generated, then that's going to be a terrible learning experience. So I think it's only fair to mention that like you're going to have to do some elbow grease yourself.
Yeah, I feel especially with a hex scroll that you're I mean that was actually the part of it that I enjoyed when I ran my Carcosa campaign. It's I feel that there's a greater degree of being able to spin something out of nothing. I think you have to work with you have to be comfortable with less prep. With a dungeon, you can sort of like determine the scope beforehand and hammer everything down. Maybe you'll get some funky random encounters when you have to do a little bit of interpretation, but for the most part, you should be ready to respond to most of the things that the PCs do. Whereas with all these these wilderness encounter tables and that sort of stuff, I feel there's more interpretation. You have to be able to think quick on your feet, turn whatever a random encounter with non-hostile werewolves into something that sort of makes sense with the rest of the game, and it's has to be not boring.
Yeah, I like to always, like, even just a random encounter, I always like to have an idea of like what these guys are doing. Are they patrolling? Are they traveling somewhere? Right?
Yeah.
And because there's a pretty high chance, at least in a few of my games, that somebody's going to charm and interrogate.
Oh yeah, having some rumors ready or even hooks are also great. For just random travelers that you meet on the road, yeah, of course. And there's of course also a chance that they'll rob them. But go ahead.
It's also a good idea to just make up something on the spot very quickly and then tie it back to the setting later. So you only have to stay a few steps ahead of your players in these situations. You can integrate your sudden idea into the game. This is part of the spontaneous evolving framework.
It's actually enriched my campaigns is by doing that, is by pivoting, and then it's like, you know what, this lives here now, and then I've been able to riff off that because sometimes those random generation things will give you just that nugget that you wouldn't have latched onto in the first place.
Yeah, it's like if you put that dragon piece on the map, on the playing board, then that dragon will stay there if it's not dispatched and destroyed. From then on, it will be part of that area, and it will start to do its usual dragon things.
So, kind of speaking to something Zerbus was saying earlier about maybe, a DM who hasn't done a hex crawl or started making dungeons yet, what would y'all say are some of the general boxes that should be checked when you're creating a dungeon? What are the key things to make sure you're putting into your dungeon?
Well, I mean, a dungeon to me revolves around the map first. That's what comes first for me is the map, and so the map has to be designed with play in mind.
Yeah,
I think that most dungeons start failing when they start putting play is not the first consideration, and instead they're thinking about what will people who are not playing in my dungeon think about this map.
When I was 12 years old, I started drawing maps, and I've been doing it to the point where that's the easiest part of making up a adventure site is the map. I can get those out. I can crank those out like nobody else. It's sitting there and thinking about what belongs in the map, where things live, what makes the map more interesting beyond just it being walls and hallways and doors, right? So the first consideration is have a map that follows the rules that we should all be familiar with by now, right? You want multiple points of egress, you want looping, you don't want it to be linear, et cetera, right? And then putting things in there that present choice. Everything that I strive to put in front of my players should give them a decision point pretty often, because if they have decision points, then I feel that it makes it more interesting as a player to know that they had the choice to go left instead of right, to go walk through the fire room or go through the creepy cathedral, right? They got to make choices.
There was another one where, and this is I feel there's definitely there's a checklist that exists, but it'll be accurate 80% of the time. I feel you can justify almost anything. I'm not sure that linear dungeons are almost always terrible, right? But there was one where even symmetry is kind of shitty. If you've explored one half of the dungeon and the other half is exactly the same shape, it's kind of it doesn't automatically mean that the entire adventure just falls apart, but it is it's kind of predictable in a way, even though you can just vary up the contents. But no, these are all pretty good points. I notice when reviewing adventures that usually the first thing that I kind of check to see if people know what they're doing is the map. And from the complexity of the map, I can kind of infer okay, the basic level of competency.
Yeah, there's in reviewing stuff. There's a style of map that if I look at it, I already say, okay, I'm not even touching this because I know it's going to suck. And then why confirm my suspicions?
But so what are those attributes? Yeah,
Hmm.
Milan, if you wouldn't mind expounding on those attributes of what makes poor maps in comparison to what makes a good map.
Linearity and symmetry have already been mentioned. There's also a tendency that looks at maps as a form of story progression with bottlenecks that sort of you have to key cards through them, so you have to do one thing first and then you can proceed to the next section. This really constrains the format and chokes off the sort of the decision-making environment that makes for a rich dungeoneering exploration experience, because then you are not really exploring, you are moving through a gauntlet. And of course, there is a role to, let's say, pinch points or hard points that you have to conquer to pass through various dungeon areas. Those are useful. But if your whole map structure is built around that, that's not really the fantasy adventure gaming experience. It's more like the modern story paradigm.
Yeah, I think we all probably have kind of different finishing schools. I mean, I would say that I went through the Knights and Knaves finishing school, so I tend to think the big bullet points that I use when making a dungeon is, uh, I do look at the choke points. Well, I call them choke points. Just like mountain ranges will define borders, I tend to divide dungeons into zone of control. So I'm looking for those. Uh, I'm also thinking how much exploration is necessary to find something with what I call the woe factor. Um, Up and down verticality within a level, connections up and down between levels. Where am I going to put? My rule of thumb is 3 times the amount of treasure and magic necessary to level an entire party on a dungeon level as my ballpark. And then last, and to me this is the most important thing, can the dungeon be Leroy Jenkins? Because it has to be able to be Leroy Jenkins. You can't get so creative and trying to be super great that if you have a group of players who are just having not what I would call an off night, but they're just not hitting a home run tonight, and they just want to sit down and Leroy Jenkins it. Is it possible? If it's not possible, then you're building in failure factor. So
Wait, but when you say "is it possible," that doesn't necessarily mean it's likely, right?
well, what I mean is that I'm always when I design a dungeon, I try and think of the guy who's just going to sit down. He probably just wants to fight some stuff. Just average players looking for average play on an average night. Can they be successful? Can they get what they want? Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to find everything. That doesn't mean that they're going to hit the highest points of the dungeon. But will they fail? If that is likely, then I start redesigning stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you put in these extreme roadblocks, then there is a great likelihood that the players are going to be hitting them. If processing through is based on solving a puzzle, and that's why I don't really use puzzles, then there is always a chance that the players will fail and the whole things will grind to a halt.
I agree with the puzzle part for the most part. I think there's going to be a question later on specifically about puzzles. I do like this idea of occasionally, and the frequency is very important here. I think because if it happens too often, then you'll get completely trashed. But I feel pretty comfortable occasionally. You add a threat where the players they do have to be sort of awake. They have to be able to recognize, okay, this is maybe like a little bit too much for where we are at right now. We need to use some sort of plan, or we need to like sort of work around this thing. We can't just like Leroy Jenkins this without taking severe casualties. I feel that's legitimate. If you do it too often, the dynamic of the game changes, and it probably fucked up somewhere. But every once in a while, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's good to have a varied landscape of challenge that you can have difficulty spikes. You can have them telegraphed in a way. So let's say if an area starts to have lots of skulls in the decoration, then you might want to, or remains of previous adventurers, you might start paying attention. And also important to prepare sections which are there for the high performing players who can solve those challenges and get the really good stuff that's hidden in the texture of dungeon. But there is some lower level rewards also for those who just do a normal job of it.
Right. I mean, sub levels to me are where are you don't get to the hidden sub levels by Leroy Jenkinsing, but you have a path for that type of a player where there's stuff that they can move around, they can fill up a session. but sub-levels to me should be the jackpots. And so I'm also looking for places where you can put those entrances to those. And there you can have your little mini dungeon within a dungeon that's strongly themed and has lots of cool stuff in it.
So
That's why you
maybe
do
we
the
can,
higher risk and reward. Oh, go ahead, Josh. Sorry.
Yeah, I just kind of like to go into that. Talking about, I know in the last podcast we were talking about those kind of sub levels or hidden rooms, and giving kind of context clues so players can kind of suss them out. Maybe we could talk a little bit about good ways to do that, or to include those in a dungeon.
Well, I mean, every sub level to me should be themed. I mean, it's a finite area. Something it's like I was talking about zones of control earlier. This was a singular finite zone of control that was also hidden and probably only has maybe one or two ways in or out. So whatever theme I settle on for that sub level is also going to be the breadcrumb trail of context outside of that. And there are things that I don't care if players ever find. I mean, obviously, if they do, it's great, and they'll have a great time in it if they're high-performing players. But I'm willing to let that be subtle, be what some other people have called hidden depth. That you only find them if you could find them contextually by map clues, or you could find them by what you would call narrative or informational clues scattered throughout the dungeon. And they generally will get stronger as they get closer to the entrance. So if you're finding a whole bunch of information that doesn't seem to fit with anything around it in a certain area, that might be a good context clue that there's something that you're not aware of that's nearby.
Sub-level theming is also related to sort of special rules for special areas of the dungeon that I don't mean necessarily game mechanics, but a sort of dynamic that underpins them, like a level with a lot of verticality, or a level that has a lot of fire in it. We change the way the players have to approach it. That's also an important part of theming, because it shakes up the standard operational procedures a little, and introduces a sort of new rule set that the players have to learn. Like, for example, let's say there's a level where you are being hunted by invisible stalkers, and you have to learn that, you have to defeat that. It gives a sort of extra edge to that area.
Just this idea of the sub level. I guess it makes sense in the in the mega dungeon as is. But I think it's probably a good way to look at it that way, as the sub level as a sort of like the dungeon equivalent of the Saturday night special, where you do have more room to like maybe break from the usual dungeon routine, and that's kind of like where you can start experimenting or start throwing punches that are a little bit different.
I mean, Empire of the Petal Throne specifically call them Saturday night specials.
I always thought it referred to the to monsters, but I guess it makes sense that it referred to dungeons.
Zerb, you wanted to say something?
Oh, just making a joke about oops all Norkers.
The all Norkers and Nilbogs, yeah. Hell yeah.
Well, actually, I think that is a good point. I think that a lot of these kind of weird one-off monsters that we see in like Monster Manual 2 and Fiend Folio and stuff like that, I think that's where they live, in those kind of sub-levels that are heavily themed or kind of strange. And they present a finite, unusual tactical challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you look at the encounter tables, you could say that there is a general set of dungeon encounter charts, like those in the DMG, that represent the baseline, just like they do in the wilderness. And then you have special areas that have special encounter schemes that introduce something different. And there you can have the extraordinarily weird creatures. And this is also pretty good because these later AD&D books don't typically have their own detailed random encounter system, not on the level of the first batch.
Doesn't the like say the Fiend Folio include a set of like adjusted dungeon encounter tables incorporating like all of the previous stuff, or is this apocryphal? This is wrong.
No, they do. I mean, they have expanded random encounter tables in the Fiend Folio, but I think that some of the weirder monsters in there really didn't. I mean, it's still a hand-picked selection of the monsters in the Fiend
Oh,
Folio
yeah.
that are on
Yeah,
those
yeah.
tables. So I mean, when you get into like the Adherer or other stuff that can quickly become rather dumb if it's used too often. I mean, on a special sub level, you can throw stuff like that out more often. And that might be another context clue in terms of finding the sub level. You're on the main dungeon level, you occasionally run into random encounters with these creatures that are new or strange or unusual, but when you're exploring, you don't seem to find a lair for them anywhere. You don't seem to find an origin point. Well, then there's probably some sort of sub level around.
So it's massive incongruities, I guess. An incongruity would be a good context clue, but then in order for incongruities to exist, you have to abide by a sort of like Gygaxian naturalism. You have to. There has to be a sort of internal consistency, and then, and then a break from that pattern, so you can go, okay, wait a minute, there's something here.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this goes into the nature of role-playing games, is that you have to have fantastic stuff. But if it's all unconnected and sort of high randomness, there's a high randomness to it, then it doesn't coalesce into a whole, into something integrated. So then you end up in a situation where not even special things are special. They are just you are just in a freak show.
I think that makes sense as well. Yes, very much so. But there's probably so I also kind of prefer the Gygaxian naturalism approach, also because it as soon as you have to abide by a sort of internal consistency, and you can go way too far, but if there's a little bit of internal consistency, then players can also they can infer it. Just the way they can sort of like interact with the world becomes a little bit more rich. Whereas if it's just a bunch of like random dream creatures or something, it becomes kind of arbitrary, and you don't really you really don't have any way to anticipate the capacities or nature of the threat that you're facing. So you just kind of you're left with no recourse but to simply go on ahead. So there's definitely something to be said for that. I think you can probably you can get away with a lot though before you lose that element of that there's no more fantasy at all. I think you could probably get away with internal consistency that's still quite divergent from what would be the normal sort of like civilized world. But otherwise, yeah, I agree.
Well, yeah, because I mean, fantasy adventure game, you don't want passive players, right? Passive players are the death of fantasy adventure gaming. So if you're completely random, if there's no signal, if it's just noise, maybe colorful noise, maybe interesting noise, but it's all just still noise, well then players can't really be anything but passive. They're just going to do nothing until the next bit of noise comes along and then try and figure out how to tackle that bit of noise.
They don't have a yardstick or a standard to make decisions properly.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
If you look at a monster, there's two. There's of course whatever Maze of the Blue Medusa is a great example. But before that, you had what the hell was this called again? Isle of the Unknown by Geoffrey McKinney, which was a an island populated exclusively by Judges Guild style statues that did random things and then like randomly generated monsters. But the trick was that the appearance of the monster, and these were all whatever esoteric creature generator monsters, the appearance of the monster did not give any indication as to its strength, right? I think if you would treat that island as a sort of Saturday night special, you have one island there and the rest is all maybe like normal. It could maybe be interesting, but in practice, if that happens too often, again, if the players have no way of anticipating a threat or the capacities of their opposition, then the game becomes very just boring and chaotic.
You don't use every jar in your spice rack the same amount, right? I mean, like
Correct.
some of them get used a lot more than others.
It's also the problem that you can see in LOTFP in general, that it has no standard monster roster. Every monster is unique, but that sort of results in the same problem you mentioned, Prince, that it's just weirdness upon weirdness.
I feel there's a sort of idealism there, where if you are handed those parameters and you already know what you're doing, you're already well versed, you've already played it out with a monster manual, then you're like, okay, no problem. Here, I'll use mostly humans. I'll make a few monsters. But I think the problem is very often that people, they don't have that background and that basis, and then they're handed this sort of like these parameters, and then it's crap.
So
Yeah, I
he
mean,
was kind of talking for. Sorry.
no, just I would just like to very shortly say that the good thing about AD&D, specifically the 3 core books, is that it gives you a very solid system upon which to build your campaigns. It gives you a roster of monsters or roster of abilities, and you can expand on it and change it up, but you have a core to work from outwards.
Yes, a library and a structure to the way a frequency, the way monsters are distributed across terrain types and dungeon levels, all that stuff. It's already been done before you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I was kind of curious to ask. So Ian mentioned before, talking about wanting to get players away from playing passively, and I know something that contributes a lot to that is traps. So I kind of just wanted to pick y'all's brain on, there's a lot of different types. There's obviously like very mundane traps, like pit traps alike. There's some where the players are kind of expected to interact with and kind of figure something out, almost a little bit like a puzzle. So I kind of just wanted to see where y'all thought that fit into a dungeon and maybe what people should keep in mind when they're placing traps.
Frequency is the first thing I'm going to mention. If you just litter your hallways just full of traps, right, you're going to get your players conditioned so that they're just going to be, checking with a 10-foot pole. They're going to check the floor panels, right? And then you hit them immediately with a doorknob trap, right? And now they're going to like be careful with opening that doorknob. And then they finally get the doorknob open, and then a hammer's going to swing in from the ceiling, and they're going to be like, okay, I'm going to stand to the side when I open the door. And they're just going to go through these like this laundry list of precautions that is going to ultimately make it so like you're going to have very slow gameplay, because you're just doing like this huge laundry list of checks. But at the same time, if you never do traps, then you get the opposite of the problem. So well balancing the frequency of your traps and varying them kind of keeps them on their toes, keeps them interested, lets them get careless a little bit, but also rewards being careful. That's probably the frequency thing is the biggest key.
Did we discuss that before, actually, that why you should never place a pit trap in a random hallway without any context or ways to infer that? Was that discussed in the previous one? Because I totally agree. Like that's one of my pet peeves as well. So what is it? Bruce Cordell putting pit traps in random hallways. Yeah, that you fuck up your game forever now. They'll always be searching for random hallways. There should be. I feel with traps, some people treat them solely as obstacles. I think that's totally wrong. There should definitely be kind of a gotcha, a point where you get punished for being inattentive. But with that comes a sort of you should be able to infer the presence of some traps, right? if this is the chieftain's hoard, his treasure chest, then there's a very high probability of a trap, right? You should be able to, and this is not a precise science, but there should be some sort of underlying logic to many of these. So you kind of like, you should be able to anticipate many of them, and with some of them, it's going to be maybe it'll be like a tax or just something. If it's completely out of the blue, it shouldn't hit that hard. It should just kind of deplete some resources, and maybe it'll give the players an unexpected setback that they'll have to cope with.
I have a sort of yardstick that I use when designing traps, is that the deadlier it is, the more obvious the clues will be around it. That's, of course, if you go into the crypt of the demon lich, okay, you brought it up on yourself. But otherwise, if it's deadly, it will have at least some environmental signs that something is off. So for a random little pit trap or whatever, I'm not always providing clues. It's fine to have some of those here and there, and let the players or the characters pay the price of it in lost resources or lost time or whatever. Also, I think it's quite important to look beyond the standard trap types. We have very often a lot of adventures that only use very simplistic traps, like the hit point depletion trap, the poison trap, or what have you. But there's a lot of potential in traps that funnel the party in one direction, like one-way doors that close behind them after a while, or pits that also have lateral passages or descend into another level, or traps that sort of release monsters or waste them or contain the party and waste their time until they get out, and that results, of course, in a bunch of random encounter checks, or saddles them with some sort of paralyzing a character, and then that character has to be carried around for a number of turns. So all these options should be considered as a possibility, because they really go beyond this very, very simple, very 101 understanding of traps.
I think of it, to me, traps are part of just the overall aspects of world building. I mean, so you have a bunch of different reasons for traps. You have the DM facing reasons of, you're putting a little bit of variety in your game. You have the player facing reasons for it affects the choices that they make in play. And then you also have the world facing reasons. So, and what I mean by that is that when you're putting together your monsters and your NPCs and the non-player actors in your world, some of them are going to be predispositioned to use more traps than others. That might be personality driven. That might be, the type of monster they are driven. So there's some coherency there. But on the player facing side, I would say that there's a dynamic where I do want players to be able to pick their poison, right? So if you hate pit traps and you never want to fall in one, that's great. You can say that you're always tapping with a 10-foot pole. That is going to enhance your defense against that type of threat, but it's also going to deplete your ability to surprise other stuff, because what are you doing? You're walking through the dungeon tapping. If you are more stealth oriented and you want to maximize your chance to surprise other stuff, then you're probably going to be you're going to be willing to pay the trap tax a little bit more, because you're more worried about getting the upper hand in combat. That's the player facing side. Where do players want to specialize? What do they like to specialize? On the DM facing side, you're going to use traps in terms of a defining play experience. That's probably going to be the bigger traps, the more elaborate traps. The stuff that, like the Tome of Adventure Design has big tables, and you can come up with traps that become a gameplay piece. So you have that aspect of it. And then you have what I mentioned before, where when you're sitting down and you're designing your NPCs, you're thinking about, okay, well, what resources does this person have? What are their preferences? What are their capabilities? What's their geography? The traps make sense for that person. Then they're going to be used.
No name is mentioned, but there is a very popular mega dungeon that's out there that has very arbitrary traps that you roll to see what kind of trap it is, and if you roll high on that table, it's a bottomless pit. So that's an insta kill. So some people don't really buy into the do some resource drains, present a variety of challenges, and have reasons. Some are just like I believe that there's a subset of kind of players that just get a thrill out of posting a body count, right? And I think that's a kind of a cheap way to do it, but that's just my opinion.
I do agree with the idea that if you're using traps to the point where players are going through their little standard operating procedure and they're just repeating it like a mantra every like every room they go into, then you've gone too far. You've gone way too
So they
far.
get to the point where, can we just skip asking the same questions? We're just going to do this in every room. We'll take the extra random encounter checks.
I guess part of the but then like part where the player skill comes in is that like you make that trade-off usually, but being able to recognize situations where you really shouldn't be doing that is, I guess that's like what would separate the really good players from the the average scrubs.
Absolutely, because a good group of players is going to control the pacing, and they're going to control how much time has passed, right? They want to
Right.
They want to get the most out of, maybe they have some buffs running or a fine traps running or something like that, right? They want to get to the most amount of treasure that they possibly can within a session game time. But if they're just being extra careful at every corner just to take zero risk, they're also covering less ground.
Yeah, I would even say this idea of like pressure. I've been like I experience it more in my games. I look at it more in like certain adventures, and it's like my conclusion is that like good. Again, you've got a few exceptions, right? But in general, like I feel like a good adventuring location kind of uh, pushes the players into a sort of they get into a sort of pace where where their decisions have again, it's about meaningful decisions, right? Like where you can hedge yourself against risk, sure, but if you do that every time, you're going to be a lot slower, and then you'll some other factor will happen. You'll run into random encounters, or there'll be something that will kind of force a certain economy of motion on them, right? Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And then I think just to kind of wrap up, because I feel like we've covered a lot of ground going from sub levels, monsters, traps, and everything. What about throughout a campaign? What should a DM be thinking about in terms of how like a dungeon should change? I know some people use like a dungeon restocking when the players leave for a while and come back. How do you guys like to kind of iterate and add on to existing dungeons, or what makes you decide whether or not you want to have that happen?
I feel here this is something where I I usually make the I don't restock that much. Sometimes it is warranted, right? But for the most part, I like to move my monsters around a little bit more, right? In what is it, Caves of Chaos? The first couple of delves. That's when you catch the humanoids. They're kind of in their normal routine, and then you screw them up. Uh, but if you give them, if you don't push on, if you retreat, then maybe they'll reposition, maybe they'll build barricades, they'll set like simple traps, that sort of stuff. So I like um, the method where your opponents respond, to whatever tactics you've been using. That's like I like that a lot. The restocking, if a lot of time passes, it's fine. You can do it.
But this is the thing that separates the lair from the proper large scale dungeon, is that this is at all possible, and it's not just the players clearing the dungeon and moving on to a different dungeon. This makes sense, and you can spice it up a little. But also, if the dungeon is constantly replenished, then the momentum is also kind of lost. So there's probably a reason to be cautious here.
I don't have a flat rule for everything. I have different rules for different things. So, like, for example, if you cleared out a hex entry that had a dungeon below it, or you cleared part of like the adventure site, there's always a chance that something else moves in. If you're in the mega dungeon and time has passed, then there's going to be some level of restocking, some reorganizing. It all depends on like what lives there currently and what could live there. So, like a flat rule that you could sum up in 2 sentences is very awkward. I think it's a very broad question for a bunch of very specific answers.
I think the practical way to look at it is to think in terms of interesting consequences to player actions, because that's very rewarding. You clear out part of the dungeon, you create a power vacuum, something will exploit it. You open up a tomb, you take some of the treasure, but you don't reach the end. Enterprises, thieves will eventually start to explore that and either get killed there and you will find their bodies, or they will just clean out some of the better treasure spots before you get there.
Yeah, I think that what I would call it is letting the water find its level. I mean, if you've got this big Gygaxian naturalism ecosystem, then if you make a big dent in it, if you create the vacuum that Zerb talks about, so especially in a mega dungeon, I'm specifically thinking about a mega dungeon when I'm saying this, but I mean, you've got a 3D environment. So if players go in, they wreck a zone of control, they loot it, they leave. Well, I'm going to look at the level that it's on. You know, okay, are there any other really strong, factions, for lack of a better word, in this dungeon that are nearby that might move in? Maybe not. I'll think about outside. Okay, so what's around the area? Might one of those things move in? Would they want to move in? Do they have a reason? And then I'll start looking at the random encounter tables. So the random encounter tables, right? You can have stuff from different levels on a level. There's a chance that if you're on level 1, that something from level 2 or level 3 pops up in smaller amounts. So maybe there is a faction on level 2 and some members of that faction got ejected, in whatever reason. Maybe there's a leadership struggle. I don't know. And so they have migrated up, and so you have this small, they're more powerful than the surrounding creatures, so they've been able to exert a level of geographical control on this easier level. Maybe they're pulling in some new allies or servants that are traditionally weaker monsters than they are, and they're trying to build up their power base to go back down and contest again on level 2 or 3. Maybe it's a rival adventuring group. To Milan's point, if players go in and partially wreck something and weaken it or don't clear it all out, maybe some of that treasure starts getting redistributed because other stuff has now gone in, the players have weakened it, and so the treasure that was in that spot is now kind of distributing out along other places in the same dungeon level. Maybe that changes what they can do, so now something has been augmented with more power, and so they start messing around in the dungeon. I mean, that's what I would just call letting the water find its level. But then that's just the general rule. So then there's also like, hey, I had a cool idea. Bam, that's where it goes.
At the minimum level, what you are looking to do is keep the game interesting and keep it challenging. So, I mean, if you had a dungeon that's just a day's ride away from a town, right? And you have a group that they roll up, they do 3 rooms, they blow their whole load in 3 rooms, and then they leave, and they take the day, they go back to town to recuperate for 2 more days, and then they go back, and they just systematically just do a chunk of rooms at a time, just absolutely blowing all their resources. then you want a way to have like some sort of control over that at a very basic thing. It's a very easy thing to control, with your players, but you got to think of it as what's going to keep this adventure site when they go back into this place, or they go to this wing of this dungeon, or they go down underneath the church, or whatever they're going. You want it to be like they're descending into danger, and they don't know what they're going to uncover, no matter what they think that they've accomplished so far.
So there is like a part of it. Yeah, I agree with that. There is a part of again, it's this pressure idea where I guess this would be the opposite of instead of them going too slowly and taking too much time, it's that they're still like minimizing risk by just expending all of their resources in one or two encounters and then going back to town. Yeah, you probably want to set things up in a way so that ultimately you would be disincentivized from doing that. You shouldn't. Either the monsters will have a lot of time to prepare for future incursions, so it'll get significantly harder. Or even if that doesn't help, if they take several days in between delves, then at some point people just leave. I do remember some of my players were a little bit angry at that, but no, when we did B2, I noticed that the players were taking the same route between the Caves of Chaos every time. I'd already mentioned that there were bandits in the area, that there was a problem. So at some point, inevitably, because they took the same route every time, at some point on their way back to from the dungeon, they were ambushed by those very same bandits. Stand and deliver your money or your life. All the players had spent all of their resources in the dungeon, and had a big sacks full of treasure to show for it. So it made total sense to rob them. But yeah, the underlying.
Obviously.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I mean, part of the dungeon delve itself is sort of being able to sustain operations, and the more powerful you get, the longer your reach within the dungeon. If you are very low level, then you can just scratch a few rooms, get whatever you get, and get out. And after a while, you can reach down into the lower reaches and reach for those big jackpots that are hidden there, and which take some resources and effort to break up and dislodge. But on the other hand, if you have a bunch of players who always play safe, then that sort of never happens.
Well, that's what I'm running into right now with I'm currently running a level 14 plus AD&D adventure that I made. I wanted to make it in a way so that as high level characters, it's like that you can delve almost infinitely, but even more importantly, you can always like teleport out. So there's like a level of I wanted to make something that would incentivize even those types of characters to to push a little to kind of like push their luck, right? To sort of at least force them to not simply clear whatever 5 or 10 rooms and then effortlessly go back to town in some remote area and rest in perfect safety and then return. Yeah, no, of course, it's still about that underlying meta, I guess, where there's a sort of risk reward trade-off that the players are constantly balancing or grappling with.
Okay, awesome. Maybe moving into, what do you guys think the most important? So, kind of going away from maybe designing the dungeon to actually now running it. What are the most important procedures to be keeping track of at the table, or to be implementing as a DM?
I guess it sort of ties into like what we said before, right? It really, to me, it is about that that sort of economy of motion. That really is something that you don't want to lose track of.
I mean, for the DM, I think that the most important thing is to be able to fluently speak or fluently think in the unit of turns, because nearly everything in the
Absolutely.
dungeon relates to turns. And so if you have trouble equating decisions that players are making back into turns of time that is taking, then it's going to be very hard for you to run procedures.
Build them liberally with time.
Yes.
They want to snoop around. They want to check things out. They want to sneak up on something. You start ticking off turn. You make your rolls, and you keep it to yourself until something happens.
Even if they talk too long, if they just if they spend, it's very easy for certain types of gamers to just spend a lot of time excessively trying to analyze or categorize the risk, or trying to tease out all of this information
Or
from like just
debate.
the most minor clues. Yeah, no, that's great, but yeah, the clock is still ticking. No,
I mean, I
absolutely.
want them to do it, but it's going to cost time.
Right. And I do think that they should feel the time passing. I mean, you do tick it off, but I'll just let players do what they want and say, okay, so you spent the last 40 minutes of dungeon time doing that. And I'll do it, I'll say it after they've done it, so that they mentally can get an anchor point, like, okay, this was the cost. They may not have realized I was paying it, but that is the cost.
I think one of the good indicators for that is light sources. I have never really had players run out of light sources. It never happens practically, but they feel time that way when your torch starts flickering, your lantern is low, it is going to burn out. That plants the idea in their heads that okay, we have to think on our feet.
Yeah, I think light and dark is critical with the way that it goes through a time, and I agree that a lot of DMs I don't think really enforce light and dark. I think it's one of those things that can easily get lost in the rest of the play activities, but it really channels decision making. It will force players to keep moving. So light and dark, and the other is surprise and encounter distance. That's another thing that I think a lot of people don't do, and it is critical to proper dungeon play.
I have to admit that I still struggle with that encounter distances.
Yeah, I mean, because if every encounter starts in melee range, I mean, let's put it this way. I know,
first of all.
well, right. I know a lot of DMs who are on point every time about firing into melee, but then they start every encounter nearly in melee. So if you don't have the encounter distance, then you're not able. The high dex players are kind of being hurt. The high dex characters are kind of being hurt. The ones who are better at missile weapons are kind of being hurt. You don't get the whole, like I throw my axe and charge. You don't get the running away.
I guess it's also kind of interesting that if you play, I guess according to the rules, that if you take into account, are the players carrying heavy armor, or what kind of light sources are they using, that surprise, unless the players take actual, if they put actual effort into their configuration to take advantage of surprise rules in the dungeon, surprise is usually is more often than not something that overcomes the players than something that allows them to surprise, unless they take, right, as I said before, if they have a point man, or I don't know, maybe they have some light armored guy scouting ahead of the party, something like that. They're going to be in trouble otherwise.
Especially if they're cautious and they're tapping around everything, or they want to take in 93 dogs, or stuff that players do when all they're thinking about is how do I win melee.
Oh yeah, war dogs in the dungeon. Yeah, that's great.
But yeah, I mean, scouting, another great reason, if you're doing encounter distancing, then scouting becomes a lot less lethal, because the scout isn't automatically within 10 feet of everything that they run into. And that's where the elves and the halflings shine. That's where those players really feel like they're contributing, as opposed to the fighter with 1893 strength who's got the two-handed sword. I think that if you run all of the various procedures that are said to be run, then some of the butthurt that we see about, well, this this character type is just so effective. Well, I mean, it is, and it might be because your DM is overemphasizing the one aspect of play that character is particularly effective at.
Very valid. I have a point here, and you're not going to believe it, about things to avoid when running the dungeon. It's called you're not going to believe it. It's excessive talking slash description. But it is true.
You mean DM side?
DM side, yes.
Yeah, that's a big one. That you sort of have to get into a habit of not doing big info dumps and instead going big picture. Players react, go into smaller details as they come into contact with them. I think that's a key feature of running the game properly.
Yes, I notice it when I'm a player with some of these novice DMs, and it's almost like you can tell exactly how many sentences are excessive in in a game. It's people really don't need that much, as you said. Like, you just give them the bare minimum, and if they're interested, they ask questions. If not, no problem.
Yeah, there's a definite cutoff, and it also matters because the thing that sticks in players' minds is the things they interact with, the things that happens to them, and the thing that happens as a consequence of their actions. Whereas if it's something that they get passively lectured at, that sort of comes and goes, and then they mostly forgot it in a few minutes.
Yeah, they zone out.
Yeah, I mean, the players. I mean, it's the players' game. So, I mean, they should be doing most of the talking. Now, yes, obviously, you have to communicate effectively and efficiently and concisely, and it needs to be the information that they need to be on center stage most of the time. Kind of like the Crypt Keeper, right? I mean, like in those movies, the Crypt Keeper wasn't on stage very often, and yet he was still the most dominant feature. So as a DM, you really don't need to be on stage very often to maintain the game as your game, even though it is their game.
Like the Crypt Keeper, who does funny voices all the time, you should also do funny voices all the time as the DM. That's really the only thing you should be doing, should be focusing on.
Kick him, Gus. Kick him right out.
This is the true rule zero. Now, this is the true rule zero for fantasy adventure gaming. The moment that your mind tells your mouth to start doing funny voices, you just need to instantly eject that idea, or you get ejected from the table. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. Yeah. It continues. No, I think that you just took away from the players, like, as you guys are talking about, so I'm thinking about it. If you're going into a long diatribe, obviously funny voices make it even worse. But I'm just saying, if you're going in a long diatribe describing a room, you took away that ping pong effect, right? We've talked a lot about, the back and forth that needs to take place to engage players and to have a great game, right? If you've given them all the information, you haven't allowed them to ask questions about a room, to engage, to choose what to ask questions around, and then obviously you run the risk of them zoning out as you're describing for 5 minutes a 10 by 10 room. Like, you just took away a component of the game that should be more rich and should be an actual game component. So
yes,
it's definitely, when I look through some published material, you get a palpable sense that the person who's writing this, when they're DMing, is going, yes, now finally everyone is looking at me, and they're just loving the fact that they're on center stage and they want to maximize that time as the dungeon master. And yeah, I mean, I won't reiterate what I said before, but you want to get in, you want to get out, you want to give the stage back to the players. You really are facilitating rather than dominating as the DM.
Yeah, you could mention the ruins of Undermountain as this Matterhorn of room descriptions that take up a whole page, and the box set goes on for 2 columns, and you sort of get the idea of the person behind that product and what he was looking for in there.
Whereas it is a slippery slope because you have to be short, but you do have to be. It does have to be fantastic. It does have to be, interesting enough for players to actually ask those questions. I think that's a trick. They do have to be like
there is
engaged.
that. Yeah, it's sort of a balance, because if it's too minimal, then the moment when it starts to become more detailed, the players will say, "Okay, that's that will become too easy." And you also have to look at sort of the pacing, because if it's action, then players asking for more and more information, that's sort of against the spirit of things happening suddenly or quickly. Also have to watch out for that.
Oh yeah, during combat, I very often find myself saying like, okay, you don't have time to discuss this, right? If players genuinely, because they'll take forever to discuss their tactics if you let them, right? But then you're like, okay, no, you're in the middle of combat. Make a decision now within 10 seconds. Go.
Yeah, it's like 7 Voyages of Zilartan, a very patrician game. Gives a great example that if the players explore and proceed deliberately, then you will describe a hallway. There is a door at 20 feet, 30 feet, whatever. But if they are running from a monster, and you described, okay, you run past a sequence of doors and you come to an intersection. There is that. That's the extent of what you see from your environment.
I almost think, and this is something I've been pondering back and forth whenever I run my next online campaign. This is an entirely different development to running a game, and I haven't decided whether I'm going to do this yet. But I almost wonder if more DMs wouldn't be better suited, if you're trying to teach people how to play fantasy adventure games, to introduce the concept of like, hey, if you as a player know that you don't have a big enough handle on the game yet to make snappy decisions, and you kind of would want to, huddle and talk about everything. Like every round is a boxing ring, a boxing round, and you think that there's a bell and everyone goes back to their chair and they can talk about the next round. Then just run a henchman. Like just make rolls for the henchman. Just get used to seeing how play would progress without having to make decisions in play. You're playing someone's henchman. They tell you to go attack this person, and then all you have to do is just roll dice. Like I said, I mean, I have not done this. I'm not speaking of this from experience, but I've almost been thinking about that. That's the way I'm going to. If somebody wants to, like, hey, I've never played AD&D before, but I'd like to check it out. Okay, play this henchman of this guy for a little while, and just that way you can just absorb without having to figure it out in play.
Yeah, I think that can easily work for a player that, you speak with them before the session. They feel kind of uncomfortable. They've never experienced the rules. They don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to let the party down. I could see that working for a player that's a little more like passive, and slowly easing them into a comfort zone where they'd be like, yeah, now I'm absolutely ready to roll up a PC.
I don't know. I'd always just say, my experience with AD&D is by no means not even in the same ballpark as yours, right? But in other forms of D&D, I would always say, if you're a beginning player, whatever, pick a fighter, right? Go for something where you're able to contribute and have a measurable effect on the game relatively easily, right? Where it's not as precise. Like with a wizard, if you really don't know what you're doing, you pick the wrong spell or whatever, and it's a low-level game, you kind of you're kind of dead weight. But I feel with a fighter, if you have a decent armor and a decent weapon, you have a way of like contributing that's not drastic. It's not and it's maybe a little bit harder to make critical mistakes. I guess you will be in the front line, so if it's a cutthroat dungeon, you might die, but then there's also a lesson in that.
it doesn't hurt to run through a few characters on low levels. You throw them at the problem, some of them will die, some of them will stick around, and you will eventually build up somebody who is capable. You learn the ropes, and by the time you hit, let's say, second or third level, you will have a sort of hold on the game. You will understand it.
Yeah, I think E's scenario is for a very particular type of personality. I think that what you guys just described, by and large, give them a fighter, start them at level 1, they'll be fine, especially because more than likely the rest of the table has some experience or a lot of experience to help guide them and offer suggestions too. I mean, that's how most people come up. But it is an interesting concept for extremely passive people, or people that, let's say a friend comes over for the session of another player and they just want to observe. This gives them the opportunity, instead of being a completely passive outside observer, you can get them in the game without even needing to waste time rolling up a character. So I could see some edge cases for where it would absolutely be useful. But I think,
Isn't this, by the way, also a place where you can really get the most out of those demi-humans, right? Like you get a nice and sturdy dwarf fighter. Who cares
Yeah.
about the level limit? There you go.
That's true. No question. So I had a couple of follow-ups with you guys. I like, as a listener, I like concrete examples. So just in general, for dungeon creation, what would you guys consider? And you can put it into categories if you wish, but what's kind of the minimum scope for a level 1, or a basic the foundation of a level 1 dungeon or floor, basically? So if you're creating it, whether it be a layer or whether it be whatever it may be, what do you guys consider the bare minimum number of rooms, hallways, just scope of the dungeon? I know we memed on, the 5-room dungeon. There's even, I can't believe this, but we're going to start talking about 3-room dungeons. Like, to me, that can't be real. That's got to be a Reddit/4chan meme at this point. But something, it's obviously beyond that. But what do y'all consider to be, your bare minimum for someone that's brand new, looking to create their first dungeon and get going?
Well, what are you going to use the dungeon for, right? Is this supposed to? I always think, like, is this something that the players just kind of like venture into to learn the ropes and spend 1 or 2 sessions and then leave again, or is this going to be, is it there's level 1 dungeons that, or there's dungeons that start at level 1 that can play all the way to whatever, like, almost beyond level 3, right? You can spend multiple levels in it. In terms of chaos, in terms of Thracia, even is huge.
Yeah, I mean, you could point it to some of the classic products, right? So
Right.
Gary started his campaign with Castle Greyhawk, massive dungeon. Then later on in stuff like N1 or in U1, you had a haunted house as a dungeon. Well, that's going to be more finite. N1 you had a cult. The dungeons were definitely finite. So there's an example of starter finite dungeons. So it comes down to, what is your starting idea? If you have a starting idea that's really strong, but it would be finite, then model one of those. If you don't have a starting idea and you want to get going, then just make a big old mega dungeon level and just start playing. Then you got kind of the hybrid, which I would say is T1, right? So there was a moat house, very finite location. Players would go through, they would learn some of the ropes. They were going to probably spend a couple of sessions doing it. And then they were going to go on and they were going to take what they learned and tackle something bigger. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. And I would say it probably depends upon what concept a DM who's starting out has strongest in their mind, which one is best for them to use.
There is an advice I would give to somebody just starting out is do not start too small. Then you will be getting a substandard experience. Start with a dungeon level that has maybe 30 to 40 keyed areas and empty space around those keyed areas and corridors around those keyed and unkeyed areas, because it's not very hard to combine relatively simple encounter areas and the random encounter charts into something that's substantial and gives you the full dungeon experience, not just the stripped down sort of empty calories.
Polarized. I think it's easy to train yourself to be lazy, especially in the beginning, where something seems like it would be a lot of work, so you avoid it and you take this horrible shortcut. But you pay the price inevitably later on. Whereas if early on, you eat your vegetables every day, and you just dive in, you find out it's not that difficult, and then it all goes on from there.
Nice. And then kind of the last question I had before we jump into resources that you guys would recommend to anyone, whether they be new or veterans. So let's take Milan's example, 30, 40 room dungeon to get started with space. We talked about obviously avoiding linearity, redundancy. And that's kind of my last question revolves around that. So we talked about Gygaxian naturalism, basically, realistic dungeons, an internal logic to them versus kind of the mythical underworld where almost anything goes, like from room to room. What percentage would you say for, the budding fantasy adventure gaming DM, what percentage for you guys' personal preference would you say is the best balance between those two methodologies? Because I felt like the conversation we had, there was definitely a balance, but what's the percentage? Is it the historical 80-20 rule or something different? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it's I feel it's difficult to like sort of pin this down in such a definite way. I feel there's so much would depend on context, I guess. But if you're starting out, I guess this mythical underworld stuff would be, I guess it's easier to do because you're not, it doesn't, you save yourself a lot of work. You don't necessarily have to integrate everything into a sort of semi-plausible ecosystem. But again, it's the eat your vegetables procedure where you're probably better off starting, coloring within the lines, kind of trying to make these environments that are sort of semi-naturalistic and then introducing a few magical elements until you're comfortable with that, and then you can decide, okay, you know what, this time we're going to do it totally differently. This is a place where the very fabric of reality has been gnawed away by hell, right? And I'm going to really break the rules and make something fucked up and exciting, versus you're used to doing it in a sort of like random, low random way, and then you suddenly have to make something plausible. So probably it's the eat your vegetables principle. I wouldn't be comfortable putting a percentage on it, but why not? 80-20 sounds good.
You're saying that the percentage between mythic underworld style versus a more naturalistic style?
I'd say naturalistic 80 and then 20 underworld. Yeah.
Please go ahead. I can follow up.
No. Actually, you go ahead, Milan.
Okay, so of course you can have both. I mean, In Search of the Unknown, it has fantasy, it has some realistic elements. Dark Tower has that. Thracia has that. Repenetuk has that. A lot of good adventures have that. But I would say that generally the mythical underworld plays to the advantages of the dungeon genre. It comes alive there. And if you sort of mundanize the entire dungeon, then you come back to ecology experiments, you will come to barrack room descriptions and kitchens and whatever, and it will be boring and it will still be unrealistic. So you basically destroyed the legitimacy of your dungeons, which is what happened when fantasy adventure gaming went out of fashion and got replaced by the realism school. I would say it is easier to start with generally fantastic concepts and rationalize later, because you will already have a good fancy encounter that you can very easily make up some sort of ad hoc explanation why it makes sense. So what I would shoot for is not it's not Gygaxian naturalism, but what might be called Bledsoean surrealism after Bob Bledsoe, who sort of had a sort of a whimsical take on fantasy words that had a lot of fantastic or odd elements, but eventually integrated them into a realistic backdrop or background.
I think we should point out that with, of course, Gygaxian naturalism, Gygax never. It was never. It doesn't mean naturalism doesn't mean quite like realism, right? It's it's more the idea of like this internal ecology, and then usually what it would do, which would be quite awesome, is then you create a sort of, it is still like this fantastical ecosystem with a sort of internal consistency, and then usually there's some sort of deeper magic intruding even into that, right? What is it? What's a good example? Yeah, Chokanth, right? Or WG like 4 Forgotten Temple of Tharizdun, I guess, are good examples.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Gary's take on realism, it's not usually not very strict ecological simulation, but it is cause and effect, and that rule rules supremely that you push the system in one point, it will sort of create consequences in another point, and that creates the sense of verisimilitude that your actions have consequences and generate further outcomes that you can interact with.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Mythic Underworld is good. I mean, if you're looking at an exact percentage, I would probably even go like 60-40. And the reason I would say 60-40 is because 40 being the Mythic Underworld. You want you want to have weird elements in your game. But to have a weird element, there has to be a baseline it is weird against. I think that you definitely should avoid what people call gonzo, which to me is just saying there's no signal to my game, it's all noise. That should be 0% if you're starting out, because you don't know how to you don't know how to create a palate cleanser if you don't know how to make the regular meal.
Create a palette, yeah.
Yeah.
A few people probably can do it. I mean, Jeff Reams can do it, but most people who try don't do it.
Yeah, and how many people would you say have successfully really replicated the Jeff Reams school?
Yeah, very few.
Very few. So for most people starting out, I would say 60-40, and lean into the 40 in the beginning. Like in the very beginning, it can be a little bit higher, like Milena's talking about, but you have to be able to walk it back so that players get the sense that they just experienced something weird. So
there is probably what that you have on the baseline. You have a fantastic world. Orcs, magic missiles, wizards, man-eating gelatin, and all that. And that's sort of the realism of that world. And you can have a second layer of fantastic stuff on the top, which is the weirdness, which is the weird idols that communicate with you, or which are the force fields protecting, let's say, magical stringed instruments that have weird magical effects. And ideally you combine the two, that there's cause and effect in both on both levels, but the first is more comprehensive and the second has to be sort of experimented with and learned.
Well, yeah, that was the thing I found so appealing about Stonehell, actually. That like Stonehell as a mega dungeon, the first level is almost it's like perfect low level throw burning oil at rats D&D.
Yeah,
Basically,
the
it's
rat poop
Rat
and
poop,
Pieces
Sturgis.
dungeon. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not quite James Malazowski dust and decrepitude everywhere, but we're close. But then as you get deeper, right, then very slowly Michael Curtis starts sliding in, these additions to the normal the fantastic ecology that by now most of these seasoned D&D players it like the back of your hand. And then and it keeps getting more bizarre and weird until at the very bottom, right, the reality is almost like breaking down. I think that's a really good way of sort of doing this this genuine mythical underworld sort of style. You got to ease people into it, I guess. That's the I run into that as well, where people that are new, that you immediately want to go to 11, basically. You immediately, I made this cool shit. That's cool, but you got to ease people into it, right? The old classic. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I might flip the question a little bit. Instead of trying to put a percentage on it, there's two dynamics that you want to happen when you're starting out a new campaign or you're breaking in a new group of players. You want them to be excited about what they just did, and you want them to talk about what they just experienced. So, and what drives those two behaviors are two entirely different things. That goes back to the 60-40. So for people to be excited about what they just did, typically what you have is a situation where the players felt like they were able to recognize and diagnose a threat that they essentially understood. They came up with a plan. They executed the plan, and they won. They will be very excited when that happens. They will be high-fiving each other. They will feel good. Now, the weirder it is, the less likely that dynamic happens. Instead, you would get the dynamic where after it is done, they're talking about it more and for longer. And that is a good dynamic, don't get me wrong. But the reason why they're talking about it is that even after the experience occurred, they're still trying to figure it out. And they're trying to figure out how it might impact the next session and stuff like that. But it is not that sort of triumphal excitement. That comes from threat diagnosis, plan execution, and victory. So you want that excitement to be predominant slightly, because that's what's going to keep butts in seats. But the wonder is going to be what keeps them talking in between sessions and telling other people.
I think there's a pretty good way of looking at it. That's another thing, right? Like if you have a group of brand new players, beating up a group of orcs in a cave is already pretty wondrous. For if you've never played a role playing game before, I can do spells. Whoa! And then you fight the orcs. It's fine in the beginning, right? Obviously, you gotta change it up. You gotta expand and all that stuff. But I feel especially in the beginning, you don't really need that. You don't really need that much. If you've got good fundamentals, you should be able to get them through that first session, and it's all exciting and new, right? Yeah, no problem.
Well, you have B2 and B1 both as pretty good examples that they have the mundane stuff, but they also have these very memorable encounters like the hermit and his trained beastie, which is a very deadly encounter for first levelers. Yeah, they or like one of my parties who were completely new to old school D&D, they encountered the black widows in the forest, and they were all killed before they even found the caves of chaos, and that was a wow moment for they came from a sort of different tradition of gaming. Oh, this can happen to us. Oops. That's something. And then B1, it has the barracks rooms, the traps, and it also has the pool room. And that's, that's something
B1,
there.
the pool room. Yeah.
Everyone remembers the pool room.
With B2, that hermit, I remember that because I think they had a party of 8 when they encountered that hermit. I think they actually, because the hermit was friendly, they actually asked to stay the night, but they didn't quite trust him. So it ended up with me having the hermit lead them into some sort of horrible death trap temple that's in Mike's Wilderness that I used to sort of expand it. It's a weird soapstone temple, and if you fuck with the gems there, like 50 sturges fly out of these stone mouths and attack the party. They didn't have any torchlight. It was great. Like they lost they lost quite a few. But yeah, the balance thing is totally true, and I agree that the sense of wonder, it really should be there. But I do genuinely think it is, or at least when we look at the current OSR, the problem I keep running into is that there's really there's not so much a frame of reference anymore, or any sense of like sort of like a convention or like a baseline. This seems to be missing. It makes sense, right? Because you no longer have there's no canon, right? So, but the result is like you get what E said, is that if everything is special, then nothing is special because it has no context. There's no structure that it can exist within in order for it to like stand out or be out of the ordinary in any way.
Yeah, definitely. And this brings us back to the thing that it's kind of very useful to you to learn basic 3 rule books AD&D, because that does not just give you some stuff; it gives you organized stuff.
Well, and that ties it back into like what is the most important part of the fantasy adventure game? The game. Fantasy is important. The adventure is important. But the fact that it is a game, and that a game is meant to be largely understood, even if it surprises you often. And so the OSR has just kind of descended into creativity for creativity's sake. And it's all incredibly shallow. What I mean by shallow is that it overwhelms you with bright colors right off the bat and draws your attention. But I think the defining feature for the OSR in 2023 is that once you get past the surface of whatever you're looking at, nothing is really there. It was all on the surface.
And
in a
it's interesting
fantasy adventure game, it's the opposite.
Yeah, it's interesting to contrast it with like I've been delving into like Fight On magazine, and I noticed it is the exact same ethos, right? Where in Fight On they say anything goes, but the difference between Fight On from 2008 and the OSR in 2023 is all the Fight On guys have been running games for like decades, right? They already know they've gone through all of these periods already, so then it makes total sense that you can kind of like you appreciate these creative processes because you already have such a framework within which to sort of like to integrate these fantasies into, and then it's perfect.
Yeah, the weird thing, and it's sort of a sad thing too, is that one of the big advantages to old school gaming was that it rediscovered and formalized and described a lot of the procedures or practical ways of running games in a fun and adventurous way. And these worked very well, and then they were forgotten again.
Yes.
And maybe not properly transmitted. That's also part of it, because
if I was sinning, I would even say deliberately obscured.
Yeah,
But
maybe
probably
maybe,
improperly
maybe,
transmitted
yeah.
is probably more
Yeah,
generous.
yeah. Well, improper. Yeah, that's the first people had context, then the later ones not so much, and there was a sort of failure to communicate, and it's there. It's there in the old rules and games that are being sort of reconstructed. If you look at OD&D, it's very crude in many ways. It's sort of written in a rather counterintuitive way, where important bits are hidden or not in the place where you would expect them. But it hangs together very well as a game, which is what EOTB mentioned, that it gives you, in the dungeon crawl, it gives you a systematic approach to managing time and encounters, monsters, treasure distribution, even the way doors work in an OD&D dungeon crawl have an important gameplay effect. That sort of gives you a sort of gamer gaming kind of experience that works on the abstract level of even like a board game in some sense.
Yeah, and I think I guess the challenge is that with OD&D in particular, and actually, but AD&D as well, is that you have these texts that are very like rich and contain a lot of information, but they don't. It's not the most accessible. You do really have to like be willing to either dive in feet first, or while you're running it, you have to you have to be willing to seek out other people that are also doing things to see like how they handle certain problems. And I guess that's another problem that well, I mean, these areas are there, right, where people can go if they have theoretically, if you have a gaming related question about old school Dungeons and Dragons, you could go to like whatever Dragon's Foot or OD&D or like Knights and Knaves, right, a forum theoretically. But the first I guess the first sort of portals that people arrive at is like Reddit OSR or something like that. You're dead. Like at that point, uninstall Dungeons and Dragons, burn it. You're done. It's like, right. You're never going to get a good answer.
Or you will get one good answer, and then you will get 5 actualities from people who play 5e or play old school games like 5e.
That's yes, correct.
I mean, I will say that help is, I think help is going to be coming. A new version of Osric is in the work. This one is going to be a teaching version instead of a publisher's tool. So I think that we've got a very good, bright future for fantasy adventure gaming, where it will be much easier to pick up the basic gameplay loop out of the book. It won't be, archaeological digging or having to go interview people who did that 20 years ago and have put it into practice. So fingers crossed on that one.
Hell yeah. That's
hope. Yeah, that's extremely exciting to hear about. And kind of on that note, what are some good resources for dungeon design and running that y'all would recommend?
I mean, for me, it's, we started out with the DMG. That was what I used for years, along with my own little personal quirks. I think that now, in addition to that canon, I would definitely add Tome of Adventure Design. I found the Twisting Stair zines, which are sold by I think Black Blade still sells them. They're written by Alan Grove and Tony Roston. They're not. There's just a handful of them. I think 3 or 4. Can't remember. But they punch above their weight in terms of page count in getting the idea of the dungeon across.
Well, these are fairly similar to my picks. The Toad is definitely one of the most solid design books that you can use at your table. And then it is also going to come out with an app that will let you just generate the results from the various tables with a click of the button. That's going to be an extra layer of greatness there. I mean, with the Toad, it has so much content that, for example, there is a table with magical thrones, and if you wanted to make the Dungeon of Thrones, you could just stock the whole dungeon with it. It's that deep and diverse. I would also add ready ref sheets from Judges Guild, which adds a bunch of random inspiration tables, weird table rules that are not always perfect, but always interesting, and a way to expand the scope of the game. It's fairly inexpensive to get, so it's highly recommended. On the online scene, I found a lot of use from Muddle's dungeon generation This basically creates room concepts for you. These have, it also does wilderness areas, and those are also fairly good. From the map generators, I quite like Dave's Mapper, which does geomorph maps. You have to sort of mess around with it to get your desired result. But if you want a layer, it's pretty good there. And there's also a suit for Uncle Josh Bear. That's the name of the guy doing it, who has OD&Ds tables in a single sort of online interface, and it will generate for you a bandit gang or a dragon horde or whatever. So that's also pretty good.
These are all pretty tough acts to follow. I'll try in my own special way to contribute something of note. I've been reading. There's a sort of early '80s, late '70s fan magazine called The Beholder. It has only 25 issues. You might have to resort to the dark art of piracy in order to obtain a copy. If not, maybe eBay, right? But uh, what I noticed about it is it's it has like three advantages. It's very solid. It's a very solid quality overall. It's only 25 issues. Fairly broad as well, where you've got articles on new magic items, new creatures. There's a sample adventure in every issue, but there's also articles just discussing common problems that pop up during the game, and it has a very sort of consistent quality to it, and it's also not too long. That's what I noticed when I started reading Dragon magazine. Is these fucking articles drag on for forever? It's I've just recently finished reading a Dragon magazine in order to check out the adventure, and it was awful. It was these psionics articles that drag on for like, and even if they have a good topic, then it's like 6 pages on half of which goes into the exploring the metaphysics of how psionics work. And it's too much. You need a little bit to sort of steer you in the right direction. And I guess the second resource I would recommend is there's a little known adventure compilation that is free. It's called No Art Punk. I don't know if people are familiar, a little obscure adventure compilation, but it's actually hosted by myself. People may not have heard,
What a
but
surprise! Yeah.
but the whole point of these first 2 issues was that people had to design adventures using with one exception, like only material um, from the book, so monsters, spells, and items, because this was to sort of kind of like stimulate people to get themselves acquainted with the wide range that like these tools sort of like offer you and the possibilities. But these compilations are totally free. You can download them, and they're filled with like the best selection basically. So these are all pretty good adventures, and there you go. Read them, definitely run as well, so you figure out like what whether it actually works for you as well. But that's the best way to learn.
Awesome. Yeah. And is there any like good just adventure modules that you guys would recommend for people who just kind of want to get a dungeon just to start running?
I guess I'll take it. There's tons, but if you just want to begin, B1 or 2 are still the best introductory modules that are available, even in the OSR. They have not been topped. There is an adventure that is recommended fairly often to begin with. I think it's called, what is it, Tomb of the Serpent King. Do not run that. Delete it. Run B1.
It's not even worth pirating. Don't do it.
It's free actually.
It's
but
free,
it's not
but don't
worth
pirate
that
it. Yeah,
free.
yeah.
No, it not to kick in anybody's teeth, but I feel like with writing an introductory adventure is actually kind of important, right? Because it's all about like what people are exposed to and what lessons they learn. And I feel like with B1 is almost perfect because it kind of involves you in as the DM in the adventure creation process as well, by doing all this work for you. But then it gives you like a list of monsters and treasure and goes like, here you go. Now you can stock it, right? Like, and it gives you some guidelines, and that's actually a great way to sort of like figure out what it is you're going to be doing. It's perfect. It's an adventure, and it takes place in a fortress made by adventurers. So you can kind of like signaling to your players already, look at all this cool stuff you can do. It's great.
Yeah, I would say that B1, like we were talking earlier, and it was like if you're a new player, take a fighter because you don't have a lot of choices, but you do have
Yeah.
some. That's B1. B2 is more like I'm going to run a henchman. I mean, it's you definitely do have places that have been left aside for you to personalize, but that presumes that you're going to do it without being handheld through it. But for the majority of it, it's you're looking at a great setup that is almost entirely done for you, and you just need to run it. So, pick which one of those appeals to you more. More individualistic, I think that you're probably going to want to go with B1. Just want to see something that works so that you have a baseline to understand stuff that can work. Go with B2.
I feel with B2 though I'll give you time, Milan, but I feel like with B1 and B2, it's also B1 is actually uh, pretty easy and forgiving to the point where even another great point, you have a needle trap in a cabinet. If you fuck with it and it hits you, but the only thing it does is like it turns your hand blue, right? And that would work for thievery, so it makes sense in the context of the imaginary world. But it's also a very forgiving way of sort of like teaching the players, okay, here you go, there's traps here, right? Maybe the next one won't be so heavy. Whereas I feel B2 is actually absolutely merciless. If you if you run it by the book, you're going to get if you're used to a video game where you can just barge in the orc lair and begin chopping them down, you're going to get you're in for a rude awakening. They have a lot of like pretty brutal traps.
I quite liked at first the Dungeons of Xenopus from the classic Horns D&D set are pretty good. That's not a mega dungeon, but it's sort of a dungeon that holds up very well for starters. From the newer stuff, I think Matt Finch's Tomb of the Iron God is rather good. It has a lot of stuff going on. It's large, and it does introduce you also to the idea of challenges which are beyond you, and that's also an important part of it. If you venture a little bit beyond that, one of the early old school adventures that now also have a sword and wizardry version, but were originally played in AD&D, a bit higher level, but the Tomb of Abyss Store. I think it's now published in something called a Stoneheart Valley, which includes the intro scenario and all that. But that's very good because it gives you a multi-level dungeon, or let's say characters level 3 to 6 or thereabouts, that has a lot going on. It has factions, it has verticality, it has interesting areas to discover, it has mysteries, it has hidden levels, it has hidden stuff that will kill you if you are not careful about it, and that's a grand old dungeon. It's really properly made and very, very rich. So I would recommend checking it out. And of course, you also have the Caverns of Thracia. That's still
And a little adventure, called Castle Zintillion, of course. That should also probably be.
well. Thank you, and the check is in the mail.
Yeah, thank you. No, there was another one I kind of and I know you've reviewed it, so I was kind of hoping to pick your brain, but I ran the Maze of Nuremberg parallel with Caves of Chaos. I thought
Mhm.
Maze of Nuramen was also pretty good as a starter dungeon, with one exception. It does have two BX harpies in a in a room, which, in case the listeners don't understand, don't know BX harpies. These are harpies that these are monsters that have a singing ability that charms everyone. They're actually much more deadly than any other version of the harpy. So when I ran that game, my party blundered into that room. The singing went off. Everybody failed their saving throw, and everyone was dead. It was like extremely brutal.
Well, I mean, for if it happens, it should happen at low levels, and that's
Yes.
a learning experience. You can first of all you can laugh about it and just cook up a new party, and it will be a cool
I mean,
war
I
war
telegraphed it. I was
story.
like,
It will
yeah.
sort of also select out those players who will not enjoy this style of gaming. So that's also a positive.
Oh, in a way that people like rage quit early on, so you
Oh
don't
yeah,
have to
yeah,
deal with their
that's
crap. Yeah, that's true. That's another good point.
All good points there. We will definitely have a conversation in the future on this podcast about table culture, if you will. So, and then filtering and finding players that are looking for the fantasy adventure gaming style. So, we'll definitely circle back on that. But I think that wraps it up as far as the discussion today. Anything, want to give you guys the final word if there's anything you want to add to the conversation or any more recommendations?
Well,
Or
I don't want to I don't want to take up too much time, but you guys had a very good there was a very good potential topic about like what people tend to miss in dungeon design, but I don't want to like sort of like I don't want to take up people's time or hijack the podcast. So only with your good grace, Gus, will I discuss this topic further.
No, absolutely. No, if you got something to add to that, absolutely, please go ahead.
Well, there was a question that was being asked, like basically, like what do people very often do wrong in like in these starter dungeons? And I thought that was a very good question to sort of like think about. And what I concluded basically was that besides sort of eh, I think I have. Oh yeah, 5 points. I'll be quick. The first one is like I do see it that people put in if they use weird, that too much of that weird stuff is bad, so that people will stop interacting with weird stuff altogether, or they're like heavily disincentivized. Um, the thing I also run into very often, which is also how I can see if people have played enough or at all, is that they don't put enough treasure in their fucking dungeons. It's actually a very easy way to spot if something has been played. There's a tendency to. I feel when you fantasy adventure game, there's more to it than just fucking than boxes and corridors, right? I always find it interesting if there's like an environmental feature, a cliff you need to get past, or doesn't necessarily have to be verticality. It can even just be a room. I don't know, a room where occasionally scalding gas erupts from a fissure, and the players have to think about a way to like, okay, how are we going to deal with this? Are we going to go around, or like, right? Sort of environmental features. Um, there was the lack of pressure, which is almost always kind of bad. I guess if you make a something inherently static like a tomb, um, it's kind of fine as long as you make sure that some of those tombs basically have enough of a right hook to make it genuinely dangerous to explore them, even if the PCs are fully equipped. And the last thing I want to advocate for to all you aspiring dungeon designers and listeners out there is to make use, if you can, and if the opposition is intelligent, of like an order of battle, um, which means that your opposition will react in an organized way, and that like if you kill the orcs in room one, that the orcs in room two will take note, or like maybe they'll try to alert each other. Or, they'll have some sort of intelligent opponents will have a plan, right, to respond to incursions, and attendant on that is the villain escape plan. this is a Gygaxian tradition. I think maybe Jaquise also does it, but it's kind of been lost. It's sort of because of video games. It's kind of assumed that the villain at the end of the dungeon, which doesn't really exist, but the villain at the end, the evil high priest, that he'll fight to the death alongside his minions. Whereas a lot of these more old school villains would have they would have some plan in case the battle is going against them, right? More like a pulp villain, maybe, like where they have a secret tunnel or a potion of gaseous form or something to do where they don't have to fight to the death all the time. And that was my rant for for this podcast. But these are the things I think I usually see missing.
No, those are all great points.
Yeah, I mean, I would just. Oh, go ahead, Milan.
I have also had a list there, and Prince has already mentioned treasure. If your dungeon runs on the copper standard, you are doing something badly. Prince touched on verticality. I think people miss that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a multi-level dungeon, although that's really quite good. But even like stairs or pits or overpasses or underpasses or sloping terrain that or a chasm, yeah.
A chasm with a rope bridge. Okay, what is more fun than that?
Yeah, that's and that's one of the big classics. And two more. Water. Water is very useful. All kinds of water, from pools to flows to whatever. People rarely make use of this, and it's a whole lot of fun. It can break up your level. It can be used for secret ways to other places. It can hide things. It can be a source of danger and all that. Water is you can get addicted to water, right? And the last one that I would call out is empty space. I fall into this trap. The dungeons work the best when the described rooms have a texture of empty space around them. That's useful for the exploration procedures to come in, for fleeing, for sort of staging raids, for monsters to regroup, and all that kind of these empty passages and rooms that seemingly don't do anything. They actually do something, and they are pretty important. These would be mine.
You don't have to spend any time on them in when people are moving through them. I mean, other than to give a general lay of the land, they can give context clues, but they become a resource, like you mentioned, falling back, retreating. Then all of a sudden that empty space stops being empty because the players are using it, but it's empty until the players need to use it.
I think there's also something to be said for if you don't have this empty space, then your dungeon becomes in a way predictable. And that unpredictability is underrated, I think, when you're dungeon crawling. If you know for certain that, like, if you were to make a dungeon and every new room has a monster, it is in a way like incredibly predictable. You kind of want that sort of like tension there. There should be moments of, well, not absolute grinding boredom, but that you need these more quiet moments in order to make the exciting moments truly hit.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of mistake in dungeon design, I really only have one point, and I probably have one other thing that we didn't talk about a lot. But dungeon design mistakes. Number one rule, absolute number one rule. If you put toilets in your dungeon, I'm going to shut the book. I'm not even going to look at it. I mean, I'm going to presume that you don't have anything to offer the hobby. If you put treasure in toilets in a dungeon, I'm going to presume you have a weird fetish. I'm going to bad talk your products. I'm going to let everybody know that, like, you should not absolutely pay any attention to this person at all. Stop putting toilets in dungeons. Iron rations completely stop the digestive process. The player characters don't need to go poo. Monsters don't have digestive systems. Toilets are never needed.
Well, there is one exception to that rule. Rampanetuk has the killer toilet. I think that's a pretty good one. And that's the only one in the whole dungeon, thankfully.
Oh no. I was going to bring up I think it was called Stolen Power, but there's a dungeon magazine. And this would have been in 1986 or something, right? The mudcore era was was in full ascent. And Robert Kelk in this adventure, which must have been 6 or 8 pages, I was triggered when Milan mentioned the copper pieces, because in this adventure he invented a new currency. And these were the bronze pieces, I believe it was, or even the pewter piece or something. But the point was that every coin was worth a fourth of a copper piece. So he made a new currency which was worth less than copper. So he could deal out even less treasure that was more cumbersome to carry by the
Well,
players.
it's
very
good. It's ideal for a rousing game of advanced peasants and craft mongers. Yeah, that's a real game, by the way. Check it out.
Oh dear! Oh dear!
Oh
Oh dear!
no.
The only other last point I think we didn't hit that I would say, and this ties back into Milan's mention of Ready Ref sheets, because I think that this was ported in there. I have it in the Wilderlands campaign, so that's what I always pull out. But layers, just to do a real brief thing on layers. Layers are the opposite of the mythic underworld. Neither of them need to make sense. Only one of them has wonder. Layers don't have to make sense. They don't have to have wonder. There's something that whatever lives there uses to get out of the rain. It's a random encounter in the wilderness. The point of layers is that this random encounter might actually have a treasure payoff. It's something that rangers can track a wandering monster that was found out of lair back to their lair. So it gives another reason to make rangers, so that people might still be able to pick up the treasure. But you should be able to spin out lairs in a half an hour. This is your 3-room dungeon, and it might not even be a dungeon. It might just be a crack in a cliff wall or something. It might be a burrow. I mean, it really just depends on the monster. But just think about how would this monster or this NPC get out of the rain, and then just make that real quick and get in and out and make a ton of them. Have 20 of them on hand at all times. But just don't get too. I see people like they just start making lairs and then it just blossoms and all of a sudden they have a dungeon, and that is not the point of a lair. So that was my only point on that topic.
Good one. Yeah. Thank you guys again for all your input, expertise, experience, and sharing it with everybody, all the listeners out there. Again, we'll be hopefully releasing in a little bit better of a pace going forward. Well, with a lot of good topics to come. So thank you, gentlemen. Josh, do you have anything you want to close out with?
No, just thank you guys for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, that was quite the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in with us. It was a very dense episode. We had a lot to discuss, and we hope everyone got something out of it. I know that I did. And our goal is to be able to provide you guys with some takeaways and some value for your games. So just a couple of points that I'd like to jump into with this. Right out the gate in my mind was the conversation we had regarding grounding the dungeons that you are creating in your world so that they make sense and they're reasonable to your players. I really like that conversation about, yes, it's fun to have some splashes of weird, but the reason that those weird pieces are impactful in your dungeons is because the world around it has kind of that consistency. And that was like a through line throughout the whole podcast. I felt like throughout that whole conversations with the guys is that you really need to have some type of baseline. You need to have that naturalism, if you will, that exists and your players can kind of count on. That way, when they see the variances, the differences, they can, they'll pick up on that and they'll create memorable moments in their game. So really like the start of that conversation. Just basically let's ground your dungeons, make sure they have some consistency with the world around them, with the space around them, the factions that are in play in those areas. I find that to me personally as a DM to be very helpful. That's how I go about populating and creating my dungeons, as well as I consider, what's the 6 mile hex that particular dungeon is located in, what's around it, what's around the hexes around that hex, what's the terrain features, what makes sense. So really enjoyed that conversation around that. I don't know. What were your thoughts, Josh? Or
Yeah,
did you
no,
have any?
Oh yeah. No, it was super good. And I mean, I think it's not only a thing where it's giving your players an anchor or something to grapple onto, to kind of understand and make informed decisions in the world, but also from like a design perspective, it sets stuff up on a really good path, right? If you're trying to have everything kind of have like a reason for existing, it just makes it easier to move from one thing to another. I think when you're doing stuff that's super out there, sometimes it can be disjointed, and that makes it difficult to kind of create other things in relation to it. But if it all kind of makes sense and fits, then like you can kind of just leapfrog from one thing to the next. So I thought that was a really, really good piece of advice. I'm glad they brought it up.
Absolutely. And it dovetailed nicely to my next point, which I'll probably steal this from Milan because he coined it. I don't know if he coined it specifically for this episode. We're just going to pretend he did because this podcast is that special. But spontaneous evolving framework. I really like that particular phrase that he said. And basically the way that I took that is you're going to roll on your random tables. You're going to roll. You're going to have random elements to the creation process of your dungeons and the world around it. And that's what really sparks that imagination and makes it interesting. Yes, does it take practice to get good at, placing, having a bunch of random results and being able to take those and refine them into something that makes sense and is cohesive? For sure. At the same time, those random elements create the best parts, in my opinion, of the world that you are making as you create it. And also, for me, is one of the most engaging parts about world creation and being a DM. So have more spontaneously evolving frameworks in your game. They're going to make for a really enjoyable moments in your game.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things, where restriction breeds creativity, So if you have a table of stuff that you're rolling on, it can give you combinations and put things together in a way where, it can really bring out a lot of your own creativity. Just really, really good stuff.
Like that one. Also, something that Milan happened to say in this one that I enjoyed, that really jumped out to me. I'll highlight it with key cards and story gaming. Is that basically the concept there is, if as you're creating and you're looking at the layout of your dungeon, you're looking at all the different choke points, and of course choke points are necessary. EOTB talked about that. I mean, they all talked about that. Those are definitely fundamental elements to have for various reasons in your dungeons. But if your whole dungeon is nothing but choke points, basically you have to have the right key card in the right area to access the right area. Fundamentally, you're restricting exploration because these are the only ways to get around your dungeon. And because you're restricting exploration, you're pretty much putting the players on rails, and you're creating the railroad, which is story gaming. And so I loved him bringing that out. If you want to make sure that you may have, technically, if you look at your dungeon, you may have looping elements. It may not be linear. In your mind, you may have it set that, they can go, several different places. But in reality, if you look at your choke points, you see that there's no way they're getting from this zone of control, as EOTB would say, to this zone of control without going through this particular choke point. And you have to do, 8 to 10 choke points. So fun, at the end of the day, you're on a railroad, you're going, A through Z, and there's only one singular route there. So I love that. That was one of my favorite comments, or at least pieces of advice that was brought up.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that kind of goes back to I don't know, it reminds me a lot when you're talking about like the spontaneous frameworks, It's one of those things where the more set pieces you have, the more routes people can take, the more things that can happen. It just adds so much variety, and there's so many elements for things to like go off the rails in the best possible way, the more you kind of restrict stuff down, the more predictable it is, the less tools that people have to work with, the less interesting things can happen. more in this context, definitely better.
100%. Yeah, you take away decision making, you take away choices, and then you've got a singular idea of how it has to be done, and it gets incredibly boring at that point to me,
Yeah, because
as a player and as a DM.
oh yeah, because a big reality is the best stuff that's going to happen is going to be the stuff you weren't expecting. And that's part of the fun as a DM too. When I think you're doing this style of game, is you're not going to be expecting everything that's going to happen. You're gonna have to roll with the punches, make organic calls. That's a super fun, engaging part of it.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. So moving on, the next area that I really liked in the conversation that I took a lot out of was EOTB discussing Leroy Jenkins. So I've never, in my
Yeah,
mind,
that one caught me off guard. That was a really good one. I was really stoked you brought that up.
yeah, it was good. I like in my mind, just honestly, like, and I could be wrong on my frame of reference for this meme, but basically, like for me, Leroy Jenkins is, you know, some player decides to go off, out of nowhere on their own and just, bust a door open, or just they know that there's craziness around the corner and they don't care. They're just going to go for it, right? So I think partially that makes sense in E's conversation here, but the way I interpret it after he talked about it is simply that your players on an average night are just going to want to go kick doors on a fairly standard route through the dungeon, right? And so if they do that, how is your dungeon so difficult that there's no way they can succeed unless they're playing at the absolute top of their game, right? Where every decision is well thought out, quickly, the conclusions are quickly made. They're anticipating everything perfectly, playing with perfect efficiency and speed and pace, and that's how they would have to play to actually succeed on a delve, on like a single delve, or they're either going to TPK, or there's going to be barely make it out with their lives or whatever, no reward. You probably want to reevaluate that. I love that. I thought, at the end of the day, this is, you're sitting down, you're looking to have a good time. And if you make your dungeon so difficult that you can't actually Leroy Jenkins, per EOTB, that night and those particular, rooms of the dungeon that they choose to go into that look like a normal standard path, then it's worth reevaluating. So I love that.
Yeah, I think it underpins just such an important point that, D&D is very much a social for fun game. You don't have to be playing 5D chess constantly all the time. It's really fun when you have the depth, and you're using a good system that allows you to do that and go into the complexity and like tactical detail and all that stuff. That's super fun. But a lot of times you're just kind of, hanging out, having a good time, playing some D&D. So I'm
100%.
super happy you brought that up.
Yeah, that was great. I'll probably talk with him more about that on another episode as well. But I think that obviously, at least in my mind, I think, and he might have said it, but the average route, both the average player on the average night, they also need to be going into the average level of difficulty dungeon or layer, whatever area of challenge, if you will. Because if they're choosing stuff that average night to go into that's significantly above their difficulty level, they're going to obviously encounter, there's going to be consequences of those choices. So I think that there's probably qualifiers to this, but overall, I love the concept. Moving on. So I think all of them talked about, but this particular point that I like, that I really got a lot out of, was from Milan and EOTB. I think mainly, but Prince, I believe, and maybe Zerbis a little bit touched on this, is context clues that you brought up, Josh, specifically using those to help identify sublevels. So you can use that splash of weird as a means to providing clues to your players that this particular area they're in may be unique, may have something hidden, and it's worth taking the extra time, or could potentially be worth taking the extra time to see if they can suss out any secrets. I love that. It wasn't just simply using, the physical environment, which I see a lot of the times in a lot of the games that I run, a lot of the modules that I run or mega dungeons or whatever. Usually there's something environmental, meaning walls, fixtures, what have you, right? That's unusual or unique. Flora, not necessarily fauna, but that's the point of this one is I like the idea of weird monsters kind of coming out of nowhere when you already have that kind of naturalism running through the dungeon. You create that baseline, and then boom, you spring the unusual monster on them. You're like, wow, that's crazy. Why were there, 3 of these completely unique monsters that aren't even book monsters? So that right there would, I love that idea and I love that tactic a lot as a concept. I definitely am going to take that and run with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in general, the idea of sublevels is something that I honestly don't feel like I really see people talking about a lot. But if you think about it, the idea that, the main payoff is hidden in a sublevel, it gives so much direction for the players of what they should be doing in a dungeon, not just going through and, door kicking and stuff, but that you can actually be kind of trying to basically, do creative problem solving to hunt down where the sublevel is. Super, super cool concept.
So this will be a brief point, but I just want to underline it here at the end is trap and the placement of those traps and frequency of the placement of those traps. You don't want in your dungeons to slow down. You want those in your dungeons, obviously, but you don't want them to be so frequent and everywhere that it slows down the pace of your game. Because as we talked about in the previous episode, pace of a game is one of the foundational things you need to be striving for a variety of reasons. For me, most importantly, that the players as well as yourself as a DM get experience more content during that session, which to me equates to a more enjoyable session. So just be careful about overly populating your dungeon with traps. They can be cool, they're useful, just don't go crazy with it.
Totally.
And that brings us to a pretty cool topic that I was really wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the restocking concepts. So what I've seen on this
for
one,
sure.
yeah, no, this is a good one. So what I've seen on this one before is usually there's kind of like a very standard. Currently in my game right now, I'm running a Doro Deep game by Greg Gillespie, and he has significant portions of the mega dungeon use some type of random generation to create geomorphs and many random tables that you'll use to kind of create areas and counter areas of the dungeon, including exploration hexes. But without going into too much detail, he also has a very simplistic restocking table that you use, at your discretion as the DM on when you think it's appropriate. He gives a little bit of guidance on it, but generally I've seen things like that in the past. You roll a d6, 1 to 2s, you're going to restock it. And then if you're restocking it, then you roll again like a d6 and it gives you an idea or use, or he'll refer you back to whatever the, random monster encounter table would be. I've seen that used before. Point is there's usually some type of procedure for restocking that I've seen. These guys during the episode really brought up some more what I would consider to be a more effective and more interesting way to do that, which is using the internal world logic and environment to determine specifically how you are going to restock, or if you even need to restock. Prince brought up, just hitting on a few other points, Prince brought up basically using player tactics in kind as a response. So if the players wrap up a session, go back to town, and they've been using a certain tactic over and over for the last couple of sessions, and they're going to go back to that same spot the next session, and there's been enough time passed, and then monsters are intelligent enough, oh hey, they're going to start using those similar tactics of maybe throwing up barricades, or if the group is already starting to throw a whole lot of fire using Molotovs, all of a sudden there's a whole lot of fire coming back in their direction. Or if they've exploited a weakness they found amongst the the orcs, maybe the orcs patch that weakness up after the second time, that they've gone. So the third time they come around, it's patched up, and now it's in fact they've baited the players in using what they thought was a weakness. I love that element of switching tactics up based off of what the players are doing and how the NPCs in that particular area respond to it. Milan had a great one of basically talking about the power vacuum, right? As soon as an area of a dungeon's cleared out, it's naturally going to create a power vacuum. And then E and Zerb, I believe, kind of really. Oh no, Zerb had another point, but basically E and Milan talked back and forth about, who fills that vacuum. Somebody's going to fill that vacuum. Who's going to fill that vacuum? And maybe too, that you were just so powerful that you overwhelmed it, that dungeon, that no one wants to mess with you, and they're just going to evacuate. So all the treasure's gone, like it's out. You cleared it, right? And they naturally we don't want to mess with these hombres. So I loved all that, and then Zerb kind of finished it up too with, if a group has found a way, if they're just going to try to maximize, 2-3 rooms, use all their resources, blow it all out, and then go back. And they're not going to and they're not thinking about the consequences of, losing that element of surprise that comes with first diving the dungeon. And time has passed, significant, couple days of time has passed, then things are going to change, and there's going to be danger that's going to be found in those places. So anyway, that was a long-winded way to say I really enjoyed the restocking conversation, and I'm definitely going to take a lot of their recommendations into my own game.
Oh yeah, and Zerb had a really good. I can't remember the exact line that he said, but when he said, I don't have one procedure for everything, or for a bunch of things. I have, a bunch of specific things I do for each of those things. And I think that's just really points towards how you want to be keeping stuff organic and just making sense on its own terms. I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's not always going to be the one. I mean, we like to do that as DMs to keep things simple because we do have a lot of moving parts, but there's usually not going to be just a one size fits all solution when it comes to running a game. And that's a good thing that you point out.
Yeah, that's definitely the point where rulings start to be really, really helpful. Just being able to make rulings to make stuff work.
Absolutely. And then the last, I'll move through these last two fairly quickly from my end. If you have questions, obviously our podcast is here to help answer those. And towards the end of the podcast, we got a big announcement to make. But if you would like to go out and see what others say about a particular topic, and we highly encourage you guys to go do this because we've done it ourselves, but avoid places that you would normally get filtered to on the interwebs, mainly general places like Reddit. It's going to be really tough in those areas to find good answers to old school gaming questions, very specifically to fantasy adventure gaming questions. And it's mostly due to the population of folks there, right? They're trying their best, but you're just not going to find the quality and the level of detail that you're probably looking for and have come to expect, from your games. If you're here and you found this podcast and you've stuck around, you've listened to this, you've wanted to listen to the second episode, what you've heard on the first, I can guarantee you're the type that is not going to be satisfied with Reddit. So I would say avoid places like a Reddit simply because you've got a lot of people that truly don't have a grasp of what the game was and how it's been played for the last 40 years in old school terms, and all the solutions that have been found and best practices and standard operating procedures. And that's what are hopefully providing you guys right now. But just know that the part of that conversation, I just loved it. Like, go to forums, really use forums. They're historical records, a modern day historical record where you can literally go back. I do this all the time for my games. I look up a particular topic or a particular rule to see, if I can get some clarity on it, if I had questions. So places like Knights and Knaves, great resource. Dragon's Foot, Old 47, I think, is the one that Prince was trying to refer to for the OD&D one. I think it's called Old 47, ODD 47. Odd 47. Anyway, that's the one that, look up those forums. really great resources to go to, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, I think, there's a big reality when it comes to the Reddit stuff, and really just the, OSR in general, right? That's part of the reason we wanted to make this podcast, is to really have a clearly defined area for a specific style of play. And when people start talking about old school games, it can go off in so many different directions. So a lot of times it just makes finding useful information that'll help you run the kind of game you want to run very difficult, because you'll be getting a bunch of, conflicting opinions, with people thinking they're talking about the same thing, but really talking about completely different things. So
That is well said, Josh. And the last point that I had, and these are kind of announcement points. The first is the announcement that EOTB made, which that there is going to be an Osric 3, which is pretty exciting, at least for me.
Osric 2, right? I think
they're calling it Osric 3 because the
there's
first
a second one.
Yeah, there is. I think the current
Okay.
version is 2.2. So now I could be way off, and we'll probably get people telling us how wrong we are. But I believe Osric 1 is considered Osric that was mainly just a publishing SRD.
Right, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, whereas mainly meant not really to contain all the rules for you to be able to run the game, but just like a reference document, and then people can refer to that reference document to publish games, legally, that would be compatible with first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Then I believe it was 2, but now I think it's 2.2. It was the next step where people were actually asking for a retro clone of 1E before retro clones were even a thing. It was like really the first retro clone. And so they did the best they could with what they thought was legally viable. And we now have the current version of Osric, which gets you a lot of the way there to running, a rules is written, 1E game, like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game. And now, like EOTB said, they're really creating Osric 3 to be even more compatible now that there's been, over a decade of time of many retro clones coming out. So kind of the legal environment, they have a better understanding of it now that there's, a lot of precedent about how close you can get as a retro clone to the original rule set. So I think they're going to be using that knowledge to help, move Osric forward to be closer in some ways to the original game. And then at the same time, too, also improving so that it can be a document that new players can readily pick up and grasp and understand, so they can start jumping right into running advanced games, which that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, that's going to be just one of the best things for the scene, is just having people finally be understanding 1E, It's such a great system. So that's going to be awesome.
Absolutely. And then the other one is, the last thing I'd like to mention is that we will be kicking off officially a classic adventure gaming podcast Discord server, so that way you guys can come and join Josh, myself, have conversations about fantasy adventure games, your experiences as a DM or a player with fantasy adventure games, anything under the sun related to fantasy adventure gaming. So we want to meet you guys. We want to hear from you. I know we interact with many of you in other Discord servers, but we wanted to create a space for new folks to the podcast that would like to hang out, ask questions. If you don't want to go sift through the forums, like I said, I do recommend it. But if you don't want to, and you want to just come get some direct answers, we'll definitely have invites out to all the guys that you hear speak on the podcast these last 2 episodes. I'm sure they'll be joining us, and you can ask those guys questions as well, and other players and their experiences. So we just want to make it an open forum, talk a lot about fantasy adventure gaming, and just kind of refine our skills and our knowledge on this topic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just should be a super exciting deal. Hopefully we can have it up and running by the time we release the next episode, which we're trying to get these out monthly. So if we can stick to that.
Yeah, and then the final thing we'd like to note, or like this final announcement we'd like to make, is that episode 3 will be coming up within the month. We'd like to start moving our episodes monthly, so you guys hold us to that. Join the Discord and make sure that we're pushing these out every single month. It's always good to have folks that are holding us accountable to a schedule.
For sure.
For sure. But yeah, the third episode we're hoping to release in November. That episode will be covering the topic of play culture, very specifically how a DM will, best practices for a DM looking to find players, making sure he's getting the right fit of players at his table, and then creating the right environment, the right culture at that table to be successful with his fantasy adventure games.
Yeah, it's just one of those things, I'm sure we've all ran into it, where setting expectations for what kind of game you're going to be running is so crucial. It's like we were saying before, people come to stuff with wildly different ideas of what the goal is, what we're trying to do, when we sit down to play D&D. So just having, more tools to kind of facilitate that and make sure that everyone's on the same page is just be really useful.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll sign off. Hopefully we see everybody on the next episode.
Yep. Take care.